And we're back like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Thursday evening here with me in New York. Well, once again, we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Tonight, unfortunately, is a very sad night in the world of cinema. And honestly, this is the most difficult passing of a famous filmmaker that I can really remember since Stanley Kubrick in 1999. Even though I'm only an enormous fan of one film by David Lynch, who passed away at age 78, I feel this loss very, very deeply. Because if I'm asked the question, give me the two best movies, top of your head, two best movies to come out of Hollywood, to come through the Hollywood studio system in some capacity in the last 50 years. Taxi Driver, Blue Velvet. That's going to be my answer. The fact that there are a number of David Lynch films that I either didn't see or didn't really connect with, such as Eraserhead, such as The Elephant Man, such as Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive. This movie is so good. It is such near perfect cinema. We lost a giant of the form. He may not have had the filmography of Spielberg, Scorsese, Coppola, but this guy was every bit the artist. And if anything, he was even more of a creative visionary than any of them. In terms of just being creative and having ideas where you say, what the fuck, but somehow makes it work, I don't even know who you could compare him to. I don't think there is anybody like David Lynch. You want to go back, Luis Buñuel? We could have that conversation. Maybe I could. But that is how distinctive David Lynch was. And I remember a number of months ago, and I should point out, for those who maybe you're familiar, he did Twin Peaks, or you've seen some of his work, but you don't really know about the fact that he had been sick, is what I was getting at. This was not a surprise. It was a shock to read the news. But there had been articles written about just how bad his emphysema was, that he really couldn't even leave the house anymore. So, unfortunately, this was not really a surprise. But when you see that news, when you get an alert on your phone, a great voice has been silenced. I feel the same way I did when Stanley Kubrick, who I believe was either 70 or 71 when he passed, right after finally finishing a cut of Eyes Wide Shut. I think he had just turned 70, in fact. But that left me feeling empty, because how many more movies could Stanley have made? Certainly a few more he could have. And if David Lynch's health hadn't failed, he was still making movies. Within the last number of years, he had worked on the Twin Peaks revival. He was still active. He was an active participant. He played John Ford in Steven Spielberg's The Fabelmans, and he was fantastic. The real John Ford was he was a cantankerous a-hole, quite frankly. And boy, if David Lynch didn't nail it. And Steven Spielberg today talked about how great it was that Lynch agreed to play that role. He couldn't think of anyone better than David Lynch to embody the spirit of John Ford. And not only did Lynch say, yes, I'll do it, Steven, but he really took it seriously. He didn't just show up and read lines. In one scene, it feels like a three-dimensional performance of a real filmmaker, one of the GOATs. Most people would probably put John Ford in the top 10 because he was also somebody who advanced the medium and made what a lot of people will also say the single greatest Western ever made, The Searchers. But David Lynch, always a character, always a distinctive personality. And yeah, you could see in his movies that he didn't process data the way that a normal person would, that his obsessions were different from the obsessions of the other great filmmakers. Sometimes you just make a movie that is not a personal film to you or for you. Steven Spielberg has made a lot of action-oriented films that didn't necessarily have any resonance for him. But he still directed the hell out of Jurassic Park, for example, or Minority Report, or AI. But AI was personal for him because how many Steven Spielberg movies in some way deal with a boy searching for his mother, a boy searching for parents, the breakdown of the nuclear family, some combination, answers D, all three. That was a project that meant something to him. David Lynch was a filmmaker that needed to be passionate to be fully engaged with the material. It's not so unusual, but he also isn't somebody who would have ever just taken any old gig. It wasn't that important that he work a crazy schedule. You have to want to do it. And this is where you get into, because David Lynch's only experience with what we would call big budget studio filmmaking was his 1984 attempt at Frank Herbert's Dune, which we saw Denis Villeneuve really knocked him out of the park. Now, I'm not really interested in that story. I tried to watch the Dune from 2021. I got about 20 minutes in, and mentally I just checked out. It was doing nothing for me. And I had the same reaction to David Lynch's Dune. As much as the cast is kind of funny, Kyle MacLachlan with the contact lenses, and some of the other people in the film, Patrick Stewart before Star Trek The Next Generation, the movie didn't work for me. But he experienced big studio filmmaking, big budget, and it's not so much that he deliberately turned away, but that's the only time he did that. And where I was going with that was, it reminds me in some way of John Sayles. Now, John Sayles he's not David Lynch. But John Sayles is a guy who was an incredibly talented writer, as David Lynch clearly was, and somebody who was courted by the studios to make big budget films. But at a certain point in time, John Sayles didn't want to do that. He didn't want to go through the process of getting notes from studio executives that he felt did not know which end was up. Now, I don't know if Lynch ever said anything about this, but John Sayles' quote is one of the great quotes ever. Why did you leave Hollywood? Why did you go the independent route when you could have had a big career making big budget films, as great of a writer as you are? Why did I leave? Sayles said. Because I got tired of those motherfuckers and their fucking notes. Now, I'm not sure how much interference David Lynch got with Dune, but it was a big budget, and there are plenty of defenders. I have read online, there are people saying that Lynch, the kind of extended cut when he was able to finish the special effects, it's terrific, but it's certainly not on par with the movies that are generally acknowledged to be his best works. And of course, I put Blue Velvet as number one. But this is a filmmaker whose work often played better overseas. And this is something that's very difficult to explain. It's difficult to understand. We know that the French are different. That's terrific. Of course they're different. Every country is different. But for example, go back to 1976 and the aforementioned Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese. Martin Scorsese takes his film to France, and it plays at the Cannes Film Festival, and it wins not only Best Director for Marty, who was very young at the time, he was in his early to mid 30s, but it wins the Palme d'Or. It wins Best Director and Best Picture, an American film set in a really grimy New York City, wins Best Picture and Best Director at the Cannes Film Festival. Comes to the United States, ask me if Martin Scorsese even got the courtesy of a Best Director nomination. He got the old double middle-fingered salute from the Academy, from the Motion Picture Academy. So you say to yourself, how is that possible? I don't know. But in 1990, David Lynch made a movie called Wild at Heart, with none other than everyone's favorite, Nicolas Cage, and Laura Dern working with Lynch again after Blue Velvet. Now you look at Lost Highway, I keep saying Lost Highway. You look at Wild at Heart. The Rotten Tomatoes score, it's 70%. It's not really that great of a score, but you might say, well, maybe it's just not a very good movie. Do you know what won the Palme d'Or in 1990? Which American film funded by American money won the top prize, Best Film of the Year at the Cannes Film Festival? David Lynch's Wild at Heart. So the French and the rest of Europe went berserk for that movie. It came to the United States, and a lot of critics shrugged their shoulders, gave it the old thumbs down, Nicolas Cage's performance, he's too out of control. The usual stuff you heard from Nicolas Cage at the time. But there's no way to explain and understand. Blue Velvet is a movie that does seem to have landed for almost everyone in good and bad ways. Because as I've talked about previously, but those who don't know, there was major discrepancy in terms of the critical reception from big critics. Now, a movie like Pulp Fiction was somewhat controversial, but it would be a lie to say that critics didn't all almost unanimously agree that they had seen something that was bordering on a masterpiece, if not actually one of the greatest movies they'd ever seen. Blue Velvet had some critics, like Gene Siskel. This might be the best movie of its kind since Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, which was already more than 25 years old at that point. His buddy, his partner in crime, his frenemy, Roger Ebert, on the same show, gave Blue Velvet 1 star, thought the film was disgraceful because it did not play fair with one of its lead actresses, Isabella Rossellini. 1 star, thumbs down. And I don't think Roger ever came around on that. There were other movies through time that Roger Ebert amended his earlier review. Unforgiven, he liked. When he saw it with Gene the first time, Gene just fucking stupidly gave it a thumbs down. I don't know what he was doing there. But then Roger watched it again and said, this is 4 stars. This is top 5 greatest Westerns ever made. I missed the boat. But at least he gave it a thumbs up. Ebert didn't come around on Blue Velvet. Came around on Dirty Dancing. Gave Dirty Dancing 1 star, and in later years he said, yeah, I was too harsh on it. It's really not that bad. And there were other movies. But Blue Velvet was a film that most people loved. You go on Rotten Tomatoes, the score I think it's in the low 90s. And if you check out movie reactors, you can't find one that doesn't say, this is an incredible film. This is extraordinary. It is an experience. And what many people say about Lynch's work, even if it's not the caliber, in my opinion, of Blue Velvet, people who watched Lost Highway, I'm finally going to get that right on the 3rd attempt. Lost Highway is a very strange movie. It almost makes Blue Velvet seem conventional, where you had, of all people, Robert Blake playing a kind of Mephisto Satan type of character. It almost looked a little bit like Ben in the Dean Stockwell character in Blue Velvet. And then you had Bill Pullman. You have like 2 competing narratives going on at the same time. The film it's basically a mindfuck, is what it is. But that's a film that has enormous numbers of people who will defend it to the end of time, fierce defenders. And the same with Wild at Heart. There were plenty of American critics that thought it was one of the best films of 1990. That was a big year. That was the year of Goodfellas, and the year of Dances with Wolves ended up inexplicably winning Best Picture and Best Director. I love Costner. Costner's my guy, but that was Martin Scorsese's award. What are you going to do? That's Hollywood for you, right? But Lynch wasn't satisfied making the same kinds of films. He was always looking to shine a light on a different part of often American culture, obscure parts of American culture, eccentric components of American culture. And when you talk about somebody hitting it at once, and for example, Clint Eastwood, Unforgiven comes out in 1992, and in early 1993, he wins Best Picture and Best Director for Unforgiven for films released in 1992. He has just wrapped filming on In the Line of Fire, which he had nothing to do with the production. He was a hired gun. He was just an actor on that, right? He's shooting A Perfect World with Kevin Costner. That's about as much as one person can be hitting it big at the same time. Clint Eastwood right there, because he had a very high level of confidence, and then The Line of Fire was going to be phenomenal, which it was. That it was going to be the biggest box office hit of his career, which it was. And he was very confident that what he was doing with Costner in A Perfect World was going to be a fantastic film, which it was. Did great overseas, bombed here at the box office. It didn't really get much play with the awards. But David Lynch wins, Wild at Heart wins Best Film at 1990 Cannes Film Festival. At that time, Lynch is directing and preparing Twin Peaks to make its debut. I think it was on CBS. And that is a show, it's pure Lynch. It could almost be set in the same world as Blue Velvet. It's almost as you're waiting for Frank Booth to show up. But he was everywhere. In the pre-social media age, David Lynch became a star. He was briefly as big a star from that kind of creative director perspective as Spielberg, who already was a brand name by 1990. Still had people he answered to. You know, he was still working for MCA Universal. Amblin Entertainment was still going. DreamWorks was years away. But he was a brand name. And David Lynch was being looked upon as that level. The problem with Twin Peaks was it didn't really ever draw the ratings that it needed. So the initial run, we're only 2 seasons of Twin Peaks. But it's the kind of show that developed a massive cult following, that people who watched it became obsessed with it. And I remember I was in 11th grade and people kept asking the same question. Who killed Laura Palmer? I don't know. Did we ever figure out? Was it Wyndham Earl? I don't even know. Just the name Wyndham Earl. I guess that was the villain in the first season. That's a great name. I joked around where how Sylvester Stallone sometimes comes up with fantastic names and other times the names are just dumb. Marion Cobretti, great name. Wyndham Earl, great name. Mason Dixon, not a good name. But Lynch, with Twin Peaks, and the fact that the show was canceled after 2 seasons, then he did the movie Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me, which a lot of critics didn't really like, and I feel as if even with some of the weirder films Lynch did, such as Inland Empire, generally speaking, Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me is considered his weakest theatrical feature film. Now, I watched The Elephant Man on my own. I could tell you it is a film of very high quality, but it is unbelievably depressing. I will never revisit that film. No, thank you. I'm all set here. No interest in seeing The Elephant Man again. Great acting by John Hurt, Sir Anthony Hopkins. No, thank you. I'm all set here. 2.5 stars out of 4. Didn't like it. Eraserhead is a movie that I saw at New York University. I saw it in film school. Actually saw it in the class called the horror film, even though it's not really a horror film. I can admit that it is, you're not ever going to see anything like it. I understand why it became a midnight movie, why it became that sort of level of cult film for certain people on the order of Rocky Horror Picture Show, although you're not really going to be interacting with the, it's not an audience participation kind of movie, but it is a midnight movie. It didn't really work for me. I would have also given that 2.5 stars. But at the same time, you say, is this brilliant? Yeah. Is this unique? Yeah. Have you ever seen anything like it? No. That's David Lynch. He strove to do that even in conventional films, such as what I would say is probably my second favorite David Lynch film, is a movie he made, I believe, and I apologize if I got this wrong, based on a true story called The Straight Story, about a man whose last name was Straight, who decides to, I think he is going to his brother's funeral. I haven't seen the movie in probably almost a quarter of a century, but I think he's going to his brother's funeral. He doesn't really have a car. So he takes his tractor. It might even be a tractor mower. But that's how he travels. And, you know, has some adventures along the way and life lessons and all kinds of stuff. But the lead actor, Richard Farnsworth, is one of those special actors who almost always played supporting roles and just had such a look and such an authenticity and such a natural charisma where he always was able to connect with whoever was on screen with him. And he made it look effortless. Now, Richard Farnsworth was actually nominated for Best Actor. That was the year that Kevin Spacey famously defeated a very aggravated Denzel Washington, who said he went home and he drank, you know, when he didn't win for The Hurricane. I thought Denzel should have won for The Hurricane too, for whatever that's worth. But Straight Story is Lynch's most, I believe, conventional film. It's not a guy who goes on a tractor mower to visit, his brother's grave, and then he gets involved with Frank Booth and starts killing people. No, it's just what it seems to be. And I believe it's actually rated G. That's how gentle the movie was. What a kind of whimsical spirit, a little bit of almost a Frank Capra feel to it. But it also showed that Lynch didn't just have to make movies about weird bits of Americana. You could say that the main character is eccentric, traveling like that. But the gentleness of spirit and the kind of overall warmth of the entire enterprise. It's the least Lynchian David Lynch film. Now, it's difficult to kind of put into words why we feel upset, why we feel not like we lost someone, a family member or anything like that, but when a great artist passes, there is always going to be a sense of loss if they meant something to you. Because if they didn't, if you weren't, like I remember in the early 2000s, just for reference, when George Harrison of the Beatles, when he passed, he wasn't that old when he died, maybe he was 60. I knew certain boomers and certain members of the kind of the silent generation who were bawling their heads off, almost like when Lennon was assassinated, because George Harrison, as a member of the Beatles, meant so much to them personally. And then there were people that really weren't that into music, and George Harrison died, and that was it. Nothing. Didn't have any reaction. If you are under 30, probably even if you're under 40, David Lynch's passing doesn't really do much. But knowing what a character he was, knowing how distinctive a filmmaker, how distinctive a creative force he was, it hurts. And I'm just, as he said, I should have never started smoking in the first place. He was never without a cigarette for decades and decades. And it is just really awful because, as far as we know, maybe he had the genetics. He was going to be able to live into his 90s. We have no idea. But emphysema robbed him of the ability to draw breath, confined him to home. He really couldn't go out. Dust particles, anything could have killed him. Doesn't really matter. It's just terrible that he only made it to 78, because I feel like he had a lot more to say. And anytime an artist, the level of Kubrick, the level of Lynch, a film composer like James Horner, who was in his 50s when he passed, you just wonder what else they could have done. And you mourn the loss the world has lost. And great voice, forever silenced. It's just, it's hard to explain also the emotion. Just as somebody who was a fan, I was almost crying. As embarrassing as that is to admit, that's how much this hurt when I saw that news come over, when I got a notification on the phone. Even though I had been kind of expecting it, I wasn't like expecting it any day. When Joe DiMaggio passed, right around the same time as Stanley Kubrick, everyone knew it was inevitable. Like, he had days to live. That's different. It was terrible when DiMaggio lived a life that he wanted to live. Joe D made it into his 80s. He lived a great life. I think he was 85 or 86 when he passed. It is difficult. He used to post those dispatches to his social media, the weather report. He always had fun interacting with fans. And he didn't look like the kind of guy, the kind of intellectual that would enjoy back and forth with fans. But then again, Francis Coppola, I would never have imagined Coppola or Scorsese would be the kinds of people who would embrace social media in the manner that they have. I mean, Francis Coppola has had Q&As with fans on Instagram Live. Like, that's somebody who really wants to engage with people. I like that. And I appreciated the way that David Lynch went out of his way to engage with fans, and was always very patient with them. You get asked the same questions. I can't even imagine, like, how many different questions about The Godfather has Coppola been asked thousands of times? How many different times was David Lynch asked about, is Dennis Hopper really as crazy as Frank Booth? He was probably asked that question 10,000 times or some variation on it. But David Lynch, who won an honorary Oscar, I think 5 years ago, an extraordinary filmmaker, a natural character, one of the most distinctive talents to ever work in the movie business. Born January 20th, 1946, and passed January 15, 2025. This has been episode 411 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your Thursday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, peace.